Philip Lymbery.
Thank you. Thank you. Esther, thank you so much for the very kind and generous introduction. And thank you all for coming out. What a brilliant audience and a fantastically auspicious and privileged building to be in. I think you're right, Esther. I think that animal welfare, animal rights, that concern for animals isn't just a fad. Actually, I believe that it is important. It's hugely important today, and it's going to be even more important tomorrow. I've just come back via Finland from China. Esther and I have both been on travels to different parts of the world. I was in China, and Compassion in World Farming have been working in China for just 15 years. And when we started there wasn't a word in Chinese, a term for animal welfare. 15 years later on, through hard graft, bringing intelligentsia together, governments, academics, all the different stakeholders, we've started to get a foothold. But actually more than that, I've just come back from the second World Conference on Farm Animal Welfare. A bit like the World Series in baseball in the United States, only in China they allow the world to take part in their World Conference. And what was really interesting is that speaker after speaker from the Chinese side not only talked about the value of animal welfare, but how important it was to deal with it seriously, because animal welfare also has a great bearing on public health, on food safety, on the environment, on food security. They're already getting a crisp grasp of how treating animals cruelly actually undermines human society. And that's my thesis. For the next 20 minutes, I want to beam out. I want to take us to the countryside, out of the cities. Because if you're anything like me, you'll see the countryside as a place of wonder, of nature, of fresh air and cool breeze. It's where the wild things are. It's our retreat from city life. And it's where our food is grown. Like rainforests far away, we like to know that the countryside is there, alive and well. Now, I've traveled across the world in recent years, writing a couple of books. And in that journey, I've traveled across Europe, I've traveled across continents to places as far afield as South Africa, Sumatra, and Brazil. And what I've discovered is that all too often, things are far from well in the countryside. And it's linked to the way we treat animals. It's been a journey of tremendous highs and lows. I remember one of the highs actually was close to home, was in Britain. And many of the farms in Britain are now pretty wildlife poor. But I remember walking through this particular piece of countryside and hearing nightingales singing and turtle doves, which across most of the country have been wiped out. But here, they were singing again in farmland that just a few years before was being intensively farmed to within an inch of its life. There have been some lows along the way. One of the lows was swimming in one of the world's biggest dead zones, an area of marine water where nothing lives. And I rather let myself down in the swimming prowess, taking gulpfuls of water and spitting it out, silently saying to myself, I wish this wasn't polluted. Another low was while I was in Sumatra. I was investigating the palm trade when I was nearly wiped out by a mysterious falling tree. It's been quite a journey. I want to take you on some of that journey now, actually, in the next 15 to 20 minutes without the mysterious falling tree, you'll be pleased to hear. And I want to take you first off the coast of Chile to the most isolated human community on earth, a little island called Easter Island. Picture the scene. September in the South Pacific and a life or death competition is about to begin. Nervous youths wait for the cue to throw themselves headlong into the ocean. They're going to risk shark attacks, drowning, or falling to their deaths. A mile across treacherous oceans are near inaccessible islets, teeming with seabirds returning to breed. Out there, somewhere, lies the prize. The first sooty tern egg of the year. Now, winning this 18th century egg race would bring great kudos to the victorious youth. And his sponsoring chief would be treated like a deity. And on his death, a great stone statue would be carved in his memory. It was all part of an extraordinary culture that thrived for centuries before going bust. They ate plenty of fish, which they caught using canoes made from hollowed out tree trunks. As their population grew, so they began to fell the forests, to make fields for crops, to boost their diet. When the last of the trees disappeared, so too did their means of fishing. They were at once marooned and impoverished. But their population continued to grow, so much so that it outstripped the carrying capacity of the land to grow enough food. When Captain Cook, the explorer, arrived in 1774, he found the islanders impoverished, at each other's throats, and down to a fraction of their peak population. He surmised that the islanders must have thought, had the gods betrayed them, or had they betrayed themselves? This historical decline has become known as the warning of Easter Island. The challenges now facing us as a global society are increasingly looking strikingly similar. Life on Earth has thrived for billions of years. In the blink of an evolutionary eye, one species has come to dominate the planet: us. Our impact is now so great that scientists warn that we're driving a sixth mass extinction. A mass extinction event on the planet not seen since an asteroid strike wiped out the dinosaurs. After 10,000 years of farming pretty much in harmony with nature, recent decades have seen the rise of a new and particularly destructive form of farming: factory farming. I've been a wildlife enthusiast since I was a small boy. I remember when I was 7 years old, I would go to my grandfather's house, his bungalow, and I would feed the birds on his lawn. There were loads of sparrows then. And I remember a particular day. I remember a female sparrow out on that lawn, and she picked up this small white pebble thinking it was bread. I remember her turning it around in her beak and then dropping it on the ground. And I remember dashing out into the garden, desperate to touch that pebble. I wanted to know if it was wet. I wanted to know if her beak had saliva like our mouths. I also remember seeing my very first barn owl. I remember my parents taking me on holidays to East Anglia in Britain on the East Coast. And I remember them dropping me off at this wonderful reserve that I would later work for many months as a volunteer, a nature reserve called Titchwell Marsh RSPB. It was the summer, and it was the middle of the day, and I had these binoculars that I knew I couldn't trust. Looking back, they were about as useful as looking through the bottom of milk bottles. But nevertheless, I persisted. And I looked across the reed bed, and I remember there seeing this ghostly flutter over the reeds, through the heat haze. I thought, that's a barn owl. How amazing. But then I thought, hang on, owls are night birds. Can't be a barn owl, it's the middle of the day. I must be wrong. Yes, but I was a teenager back then. And teenagers are never wrong, right? I was conflicted, torn apart with this joy and anguish. And then a warden came along and put me out of my misery. I had seen my very first barn owl. Actually, these days in Europe, we don't see barn owls very often. In my country, there used to be a breeding pair on just about every farm in the country. Now, just 1 in 75 farms has a breeding pair. This is all part of a sweeping decline across agriculture in Europe. In my lifetime, in the last 50 years, Europe has lost 300 million birds, breeding birds. That's a breeding pair gone every 10 seconds. Once common farmland birds like tree sparrows and skylarks have gone through a hideous decline. But it's not just wildlife that's declining from the countryside, that's disappearing from our fields. It's also mammals, butterflies, bees, all sorts of things are in steep decline. The other thing which is disappearing from the fields and the woodlands of our countryside are farm animals. Here in the Netherlands, we'll have seen laying hens that would normally love to be scratching around under bushes or in woodlands, taken out of those natural habitats and put in cages so small they can barely flap their wings. We'll see pigs who again would like to raise their families in woodland edges, building intricate and enormous nests placed instead inside in crates where they can't turn around for weeks at a time, made to face the wall. Here in the Netherlands and much of Europe, we'll see cattle taken out of pastures and instead put permanently into mega dairies or kept in feedlots where they're fed grain instead of grass. It's all part of what I call the two sides of factory farming. As animal advocates in this room, we're very familiar with the first side of factory farming, where the animals are. Pigs, cattle and chickens, and so many other different species taken off of the land, put into cages, crates and confinement, which looks like a space-saving idea, but actually isn't. Because in doing so, we then have to devote vast acreages of relatively scarce cropland elsewhere to grow their feed. And that feed is grown using industrial methods with large fields and chemical pesticides and fertilizers. And as the crops go in and the fields expand, so much else starts to disappear. The trees disappear, and so too the bushes and the hedges. The chemicals mean that the flowers disappear along with the seeds and the insects that are needed by the birds, the bats, the bees, the butterflies, and just about everything else, leaving you with the crop. And then in perhaps the biggest disappearing act of all, we then take that crop and feed it to those farm animals who waste the vast majority of the food value in terms of calories and protein in conversion to meat, milk and eggs. It's madness on a plate. I came to realize when I went to Brazil, actually, how this madness is affecting not only our own countryside, in the Netherlands, in the rest of Europe, in my country, in Britain, but also on continents far away. I remember being in Brazil, and I remember walking through waist-high grasses and past thin, twisted trees and springy bushes. I remember hearing birds singing all around. And there were insects pinging themselves skywards or scuttling away. I was in Emmaus National Park, a rare, pristine patch of paradise, of rich savanna, the kind of wooded woodland, the wooded grassland that once covered much of the interior of Brazil. But you know what? It was like nature's last stand. Behind me was this rich web of life. In front of me and all around, as far as the eye could see, was soya. There were no hedges, there were no crop boundaries, very few trees. It was just one newly planted crop after another, doused in chemicals, spraying nature away. Whilst I was there, I never did get to see a wild jaguar, although they were in the national park, but I did get to talk to a guy called Leandro Silveira, known as the Dean of Jaguar Conservation in Brazil. And jaguars, of course, are apex predators, so they are a wonderful indicator of the health of the countryside. And I asked him what all of this meant for the jaguar. And he said to me, quite matter-of-factly, when you clear-cut the land and remove their prey, you're affecting the cat directly. You're silently wiping out the species. But we shouldn't blame soya per se, because soya actually is a wonder crop. It's a fantastic, complete protein for people. If that soya was grown not in those monocultures, but instead in mixed rotational farms without the chemicals, on existing farmland instead of deforested land, then that would be great. It would be so much better too if that soya was being used to feed people. Something which our founder very much believed 50 years ago. He was importing this stuff directly to feed to people. But the truth is, the vast majority of the soya in the world, in Brazil and Argentina and so much else, is being used to feed factory farms. What a waste. Europe, including the Netherlands, imports 35 million tons a year. To give you a visual picture, in South America, all the soya we import covers an area of South America equivalent to a country the size of Greece. That's the damage we're doing. That's the damage our factory farming is doing. And they call it, the industry call it, some of the best animal welfare in the world. Well, take a look at what it's doing. That's what I say to them. Come and see for yourselves. But it's not just birds, bees, butterflies in Europe. It's not just jaguars in Brazil. I've seen what factory farming is doing to elephants, to the Sumatran elephant, down to less than 2,000 individuals in the whole world. And their forest home in Indonesia is shrinking as the palm plantations increase. And we know about the palm industry and what that's doing in terms of the vegetable oil component. But what not many people knew, I think, until we investigated it, is that palm products are also being used to feed industrially reared animals, particularly here in Europe, particularly to feed intensively reared dairy and beef cattle, leading to the demise of these most wondrous creatures. And it's not just land animals that are being affected, creatures that inhabit the sea too. Vast quantities of fish in South America, off the coast of South Africa, in the North Sea, are scooped up. About a fifth of the world's fish catch, scooped up, ground down into fish meal, and then used to feed factory-farmed fish, pigs, and chickens, leaving penguins and puffins starving. Ladies and gentlemen, what I've come to realize is that factory farming is not only the biggest cause of animal cruelty on the planet, it is also a major driver of wildlife declines across the world. In the 40 years since the widespread adoption of factory farming, the world has lost half of all of its wildlife, half of all the birds, all the mammals, half of all the fish, the amphibians, the reptiles, gone. But factory farming is also driving declines in pollinating insects. And this is a travesty, given that, as I'm sure you're all aware, we need pollinating insects for the very existence of a third of all our food worldwide. But perhaps even more concerning is the effect that industrial agriculture has on the world's soils. Because industrial farming, with its chemicals and its machinery and its general disregard for the natural world, is leading to soils diminishing in value and eroding, being washed out to sea. So much so that the United Nations predicts if we continue as we are, then we have less than 60 harvests left in the world's soils. That's where 97% of our food comes from right now. What that means is that a child born today won't even be at retirement age as we currently understand it before he or she witnesses the death of our food system. The end of food as we know it. Which is why I believe that we need a wake-up call to the world. We need to end factory farming while we still can. But there are huge vested interests out there. And when those vested interests have their backs against the wall, major chemical companies, animal feed companies, drug companies that give the antibiotics, half of the world's antibiotics are fed to factory farmed animals, the machinery companies, and when they have their backs to the wall, and I should say here that actually it's not farmers that are to blame, it's not farmers that are benefiting, it's these huge companies, and when they have their backs to the wall, they justify it by saying, we need factory farming to feed the world. We've got to double food production, they say. Goodness me, don't you know there's going to be 10 billion people by the middle of the century? Why are you worrying about animals? Why do we worry about animals? Well, the truth is, ladies and gentlemen, yes, 7.5 billion now, 10 billion by the middle of the century. If we take enough action, we'll be able to stabilize the population at about 11 to 12 billion people. The food system worldwide that so far, as yet, is not yet dominated by industrial agriculture, produces enough food for 16 billion people. More than enough for everyone today and in the foreseeable future. That's not to say that 16 billion people all at once on the planet would be a good thing. It would not. It would be an environmental disaster. It's to say that actually we can feed everyone today and in the foreseeable future with less farming, not more. So what's going wrong? Well, we're all now thankfully well aware that there's so much waste in the food system, being wasted in our homes, in the supply chains, in the supermarkets, being let to rot in developing countries for want of simple investments like grain stores to stop it going mouldy. But actually, the biggest portion of food waste on the planet is in feeding human edible crops to factory farmed animals. In that transaction, we waste enough food to feed between 4 to 5 billion people every year. Yet factory farmers will have us believe we need it to feed the world. Oh, and it's efficient. I ask them time and time again, what's efficient about wasting enough food to feed more than half of humanity today? What we need, ladies and gentlemen, is a revolution. We need a revolution in understanding. We need to recognize, all of us in this room recognize, but we need to go forth and multiply our understanding and get that recognition out there that actually factory farming, no good comes of it. That it is the biggest cause of animal cruelty, that it is the biggest driver of, one of the biggest drivers of wildlife declines on the planet, but also it's making it harder to feed people rather than easier. And with that recognition, big change can come. What we also need are to put forward the solutions. One of the solutions, of course, is to reduce meat and dairy reliance, to stop the factory farming and keep any animals that we have in decent conditions. And I believe that it's always great to point to those that are already doing it to show how. And let me introduce you to someone that I know quite well. He lives near me in the south of England. This is a guy called Tim May. Now, Tim is an interesting fellow because he was a factory farmer. He has a farm that's 10 times bigger than the average farm size in the UK. It's pretty big. He used to use 9 different chemicals on each of his harvests, each of his crops. What an awful cocktail to put in the environment. He realized that it didn't matter how much he doused his chemicals, his crops in chemicals, that his yields were declining. Here's a warning for the world. Those chemicals couldn't arrest the decline. A bit like Easter Island. So what did he do? Did he dial up the chemical man and say, hey, give me something stronger? Like his drug pusher? He doesn't do drugs. No. What he did was something radical. He was radical enough to reintroduce farm animals to their ecological niche as rotational grazing animals. And now his animals are kept without feeding the cattle and the sheep with a single grain. And they move around the farm. You know, we've heard this circular farming, this circular economy. His animals are truly circular. His farm is truly circular. His animals move around the farm. And I believe that there are many solutions out there. I believe that actually the solution is simple. The solution is ending factory farming. And in so doing, let the profusion of alternatives multiply and fill the space. Give them the room to breathe. I also believe that things are now getting so serious. In this age of 12 years left to sort climate change, in this age of 60 harvests left, we need something big and joined up. We need a global agreement, akin to the Paris Agreement on climate change, to move away from factory farming in favor of compassionate and regenerative food systems. And a compassionate regenerative food system will also need a radical reduction in the amount of meat and dairy that we produce. We're going to need to reduce it by more than half. Frankly, if we're going to survive, I believe. But I think that we can all play our part. Here in these political buildings, we can push for new and stronger policies to move away from the madness, the great disappearing act of factory farms. Corporates are also coming on board. Corporations are queuing up now to make the latest swinging change for animal welfare, going cage-free on all of their eggs, for example. We're going to need to see a new revolution where they also commit to reducing the amount of meat and dairy that they use. But there's also something we can all do as individuals. We can go out and we can tell people about this because recognition is the first step to ending the problem. And we can also do something as consumers 3 times a day because we all have the power 3 times a day through our food choices to end an awful lot of farm animal cruelty. And also save wildlife, not just here, but on other continents. Animals like jaguars, elephants, and penguins. By eating more plants. And if we do choose meat and dairy, to make sure it comes from better systems and eat less of it. Better systems such as pasture-fed, organic, and free range. But I think the future for our protein needs is actually, as it's always been in the past, heavily dependent on plants. Most of the world's protein today comes from plants. If the world is going to survive, if human society is going to survive in great shape rather than just exist, then plants are going to need to be the bedrock of our diets in the future. In this way, ladies and gentlemen, in this way, I believe we can create a future for ourselves and for our children and our children's children that is much less like that tale of decline on Easter Island and much more a celebration of life. Thank you very much.